Leviatan's offseason is not going very well so far. There is news that both Mazzino and Ospos will be leaving the roster for the next season. Of course, the news around Ospos also includes the fact that Bleed has been kicked out of the VCT. He was probably going to go to Bleed, so he doesn't have a team to go to right now. So maybe that makes him find his way back to Leviathan, but there's a lot of rumors swirling around. It doesn't seem like Ospos is coming back, and that would be a huge blow to them. A year removed from picking up arguably the best player in Valorant, losing him after a year where you didn't exactly meet expectations aside from champs at the end of the year, but you still didn't win. That to me is an organizational failure. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at Leviatan's past season, talking about how their season went, what they might potentially lose if both Ospos and Mazzino leave, and just going over how the year went and talking about, did this team succeed in what they wanted to do, or was the whole thing just a waste of time? So this is the board we have today. Like all the other season debriefs I've been doing, we will be starting with the 2024 placements. Talking about how Leviatan's year went, starting with kickoff, they didn't exactly meet expectations right away. They were built in the offseason to be a super team, betting on the likes of Ospos and Tex, as well as a player from the former champs winning Evil Geniuses roster in Com. But Com did come into the roster pretty late into the offseason. They of course swapped Noswer in the now infamous move, and it was word that that did cause some fractures within Ospos and the organization. And the early returns on this new roster weren't exactly great. At kickoff, they did have a 7th to 9th placement. They did beat 100 Thieves, go on to face Loud, but they couldn't beat either Loud or Sentinels. But hey, the roster is still new. Only 2 teams were allowed to make it to Madrid. So you regroup and go into stage 1, hoping you can turn things around. And they did end up doing that, although maybe a little inconsistent at times. They still ended up placing 3rd. They did end up qualifying for Shanghai after beating Crew, but they couldn't beat G2 to make to the grand finals of the Americas playoffs. It was a very long best of 5, but hey, 3rd place, not too bad. You end up in the group stage of Shanghai, so that's not ideal because you don't get the bye round of being the top seed, but you know, this team should be able to make it out of groups, right? Nope, that did not happen. The Swiss stage in Shanghai was a disaster for this team. They did win 1 match, but they needed to win 2 to be able to make it to that playoff stage, and it did not work. They lost Foot Esports, 9th to 10th placement. So a team that looked very good in the Americas. They had a pretty slow start at kickoff. Some of their players were still getting acclimated, but stage 1, aside from being a little inconsistent, definitely seemed like they hit a stride. They were hoping to go far at Shanghai, and it just did not happen. So because of that poor performance at your first international, a lot of people started doubting this team. Personally, I thought this team was a lot better than what a lot of people were saying after their poor Shanghai performance. I thought, hey, it's fine if a team has 1 bad tournament, they can regroup for champs, and stage 2, it should be a pretty good stage for them. And that ended up being exactly the case. They did place 1st in stage 2, winning the playoff bracket, taking home the Americas trophy. They did lose to G2 in that playoff bracket, but then they stormed their way back and won the whole thing. So they head into champions as the victor of the VCT Americas League, the best team in Americas, and a potential champions contender. And after an unfortunate loss to Trace Esports in the group stage of champions, one of the bigger upsets of that tournament, they did end up making it all the way to the top 4. Losing in the upper final to Edward Gaming, the eventual tournament winners, they could not rally back. Ended up winning 1 map out of 4 against Team Heretics to lose out on their chance of taking home Ospos' 2nd champions trophy. So overall, when you look at their placements, it is quite up and down. Slow start at kickoff, top 3 spot at stage 1, poor performance at Shanghai, top of your league, top 3 at champs, but could not end up winning it. So after this pretty solid performance at Champions, if this roster stayed together for the next year, could they win a tournament? I think they showed enough in both Stage 2 and Champions to say that they could be a tournament contender. They could maybe win a Masters or a Champions in 2025. However, as already talked about, it's probably not going to be the same roster next year. Looking at some other stats, we will be looking at their best and worst map. Their best map was famously Icebox. They have an insane record on it, 16-4 on the year. thier. Attack win percentage was 59% and defense was 54. They were nearly unstoppable on this map. Every time a team won against them on this map, that ended up being a match that they lost, which makes a lot of sense. You lose your best map, probably gonna knock you off your confidence a little bit. In terms of worst map, there really wasn't a lot to choose from. They did have a 0-3 record on Split, so I thought about putting it down, but they didn't play it enough for me to justify putting it on the board. However, on buy, they have a 6-6 record, so they were even on this map. Attack was pretty poor with a 43% win rate, defense was 53. So even one of the worst maps ended up not being too bad statistically for them. They did go even on bind, so not too much of a knock on that team. Moving on to their total attack and defense win percentages, in 856 rounds on attack, they had a 51% win rate, winning 30 more rounds than they lost, 443 won to 413 lost. When it comes to defense, in 922 rounds, they had a 52% win rate, 483 won to 439 lost. So overall, they were pretty good on either ends of the map. They definitely played more defense than attack, but ended up having over 50% win rates. Not too big of a gap, but still quite solid on both sides. So while I definitely had questions heading into the season about this roster construction, especially with Ospos and Tex both being duelist players, Ospos being clearly the better of the two is definitely going to get more duelist time than Tex, and that did end up being the case. And swapping out Calm for Noswer, we'll get to Calm and his stats, but I think keeping Noswer might have been the better move. You might have gotten a bit better of a performance out of Noswer than you did Calm. I understand the draw of getting a world champion winner, but Calm wasn't the only player on that team pulling their weight. And that brings us to the individual player stats for all of this roster. In 2024, at all 5 events, Ospos had an ACS of 245.6, one of the best in the entire VCT, 1,591 kills, 1,160 deaths, 319 assists for key ratio of 1.34. That is also one of the best in the entire VCT. Ospos is one of those duelist players that maybe it's because of him being a bit more passive than, say, a Zekin or a Jogamo. He's very good at getting a lot of kills and not dying very much. So maybe he's not exactly the most aggressive player ever, but he's very calm and calculated, and he knows where to pick his spots, and it works out very well for him. Him potentially going to Bleed, I thought that would have been a bad idea for his career, because Bleed was just such a big disaster last year that I don't think any player should want to join that team. I know it would be a different situation than what Ye experienced, and Ospos is definitely better than Ye, sorry Ye, but still I don't feel like that would be the best fit. I think Ospos needs to go to an organization that has proven that they can manage a roster well. During the year, he only played duelists, which makes a lot of sense. He played Jet, he played Raze, Neon, Reyna, and a little bit of Phoenix. I don't remember him playing Phoenix, but it was on the match results, so apparently he played Phoenix. I do think Ospos is going to be a great addition to whatever team he ends up joining. I just think he has to join an org that is known to work well with their players, known to build rosters well. He apparently wants to go to a VCT Pacific team. He wants to live in Korea, and as a North American fan, you guys can take him. Makes the Americas League a lot easier to deal with. But even so, I hope Ospos ends up on a competitive team, because we need to see this guy on the international stage. It would just be such a bummer if he has a situation like Ye's last year, where I don't think it would go exactly the same, because I think it'd be a situation of Ospos would just clearly be the best player on a bad team if the situations were similar. But even so, I think Ospos, we need to see this guy at Champions next year. Moving on, we have Mazzino, who is another rumored exit of the roster. At times throughout the year, there was an argument for Mazzino being the best player aside from Ospos. He overall had an ACS of 198.6, which isn't super high, but for the role he's playing is pretty impressive. 1,293 kills, 1,262 deaths, 703 assists for key ratio of 1.02. Doing this while playing a smoke/initiator flex role, playing Harbor, Omen, Astra, Brim, KO, Breach, and Deadlock. So Mazzino is a player that Leviatán really wants to keep. They have offered him a new contract apparently, but even according to, I believe, one of the higher ups at Leviatán, he's about 80% out of the roster. He is looking at a different venture, and whatever team ends up getting him, you're getting a very talented smokes player, but I also fear that this year might have been a career year for him. Before this year, Mazzino was definitely known as a very solid Latin America player, but has he always been known as one of the top smokes players in the world? world? I'm gonna say probably not. Definitely known as a very solid one, and he showed a lot of incredible skill this year, but can he keep that up on a team that doesn't have Ospos? That is definitely a question we're going to have answered. Moving on, we have this team's IGL in Kane, who is probably staying on the roster. I haven't seen any news of him moving on to a different roster, and I think this team should do everything they can to keep him if he's thinking of leaving. Kane was definitely one of the more underrated IGLs of the year. A lot of people focused on Ospos and Mazzino during the year, but Kane had some really solid numbers for himself while being a pretty solid IGL. An average combat score of 203.2 on the year, 1,286 kills, 1,129 deaths, 650 assists for key ratio of 1.13, the second best on the team. Doing this while playing a lot of different roles. He played Viper, KO, Breach, Omen, and Brim, so much like Mazzino, a Smokes Initiator flex. Probably seeing him more on the Initiators than you're seeing him on the Smokes, but even so, Kane is good on whatever character you put him on. Very curious to see what Kane can do next year without having Ospos on his team. We'll see what other players Leviatán end up picking up. The current rumor for them is Demon 1. They have offered Demon 1 a deal. I haven't seen reports that he's taken that deal yet, so we'll see where that goes, but that'd definitely be an interesting combo with Kane and Demon 1. Moving on, we have their two off-season additions in Tex and Com. Starting with Tex's stats, after a pretty slow start to the year, he definitely evened out his stats a bit. He had an average combat score of 193.6, 1,223 kills, 1,232 deaths, 356 assists for key ratio of just under 1 at 0.99. But he only had 9 more deaths than he had kills, so you can basically call that even. Doing this while playing Gecko, Raze, Cypher, Killjoy, and Sage. Mainly playing the center role with the Cypher, Killjoy, and the Sage, but he was decent on the Gecko at the very least. I've made this point with Tex before, but I feel like he was put in a role that I don't think is the best for him. Seeing him on the guard being their main duelist, he was very good with them, and while he got to play a little bit of Raze on this roster, for the most part, he was on different roles. Maybe if we see Demon 1 come into this team, Tex can be the Jogamo to Demon 1 kind of combo that Evil Geniuses had. So that is something that I could see working. I think Tex is going to have a big year in 2025. Maybe with Ospos off the team, he's going to get more of a chance to shine. Moving on, we have Com, and I've already talked about length about the Nosworth swap for Com, but ignoring that part of it, how did Com do? Was that move justified? Overall, his stats aren't great. He had an average combat score of 173, which is quite low. It's easily the lowest on the team. 1,049 kills, 1,170 deaths, 564 assists for key ratio of 0.89. Doing this while playing Sova, Sage, Fade, Viper, and Cypher. And while these stats are bad, it is important to point out that, like most support roles, he's not the one meant to be getting the high stats. He is the lowest on this team in both ACS and kills, but that is not something that he has to do, especially when you have Ospos on your team. However, when the numbers are this low, a key ratio of 0.89, ACS of 173, that is definitely concerning. Would Nosworth have done better? We're never gonna know. It doesn't matter at this point. But what is important is how Com bounces back from this in the future. He was statistically one of the worst players in the Americas on a team that was pretty good. I definitely think that potentially playing with an old teammate in Demon 1 is something that could help his performance. I didn't really expect Leviatán to keep him after this season, but with Ospos and Mazzino leaving, you kind of just need to keep him at that point. So if you're Leviatán or a fan of the team, you're banking on a bounce back year from Com. You're hoping he can find some of that Evil Geniuses magic. At Champions 2023, Com was getting every clutch he possibly could. He was just insane in that tournament. He could definitely show some of that magic again. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm not setting my expectations very high for him, but I think that that's probably a good thing. Now with the pressure off of trying to prove that you're better than Nosworth, which, maybe he wasn't thinking about, but it was something the community was definitely focusing on. Maybe with that in the past, you can now just focus on being a better player on this team that is going to need players to pick up the slack with Ospos and Mazzino gone. So overall, is the 2024 season a failure for this team? I'm going to say for the most part, no, at least from a team perspective. Their placements are pretty good. Top 3 at the biggest tournament of the year in Champions, definitely impressive. Winning your own region, very impressive as well. These are the best results that this organization has ever had in Valorant's history. So while in my previous video about how to build a team, I went on a long rant about Leviatán, I don't think that this team was a total failure. What I do think is a failure is the fact that they made Ospas unhappy. Maybe it's his dream to go to a team in Korea. Maybe that was his goal all along, is to get off this team after this year and go play for the Pacific League. That is something that isn't entirely in Leviatán's control. However, I think if you're going to invest this much time, this much money, this much effort into this player, I think they should have done more to make him happy. Whether that be the Noswar move or anything else that happened during the season, it doesn't really matter. Leviatán as an org should have done more to hang on to this incredibly talented player. Because with him gone, while Demon 1 wouldn't be a bad replacement at all, I don't think that they would be able to get top 3 in Champions again. We'll see what happens with Mazzino as well. I think that is at least more replaceable, but Mazzino definitely showed some very high skill this year. We'll see where this roster ends up going. We'll see if they pick up Demon 1, if that ends up going through. My guess is it probably does. But anyway, it's going to be a very interesting offseason for the other Latin American team that isn't employing any Latin American players aside from King. So we'll see what ends up happening, but I think this team, at least from an organization perspective, failed. Let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of Leviatán in the 2024 season. Do you think it was a failure? Do you think they were a good team? What do you think ends up happening with Ospas? Does he come back after the bleed situation, or does he keep pursuing teams in the Pacific? Let me know in the comment section down below what do you think is going to happen. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!